Hey everybody, welcome to Acrylics Made Easy. Today we're going to talk about painting rocks. Over on our palette here we've got our golden fluid acrylics, yellow ochre, Hansa yellow, vat orange, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, Payne's gray, burnt umber light, and titanium white. I'm going to start off with a number 6 filbert brush. I'm going to get some of this white paint here and a little bit of yellow ochre. Make a real nice light color to sketch out shape of a rock. We're going to do a few rocks on here of different shapes. Start with an oval. Alright, so for an oval, smooth rock, I like to just kind of give myself an outline and then give myself a sense of where the lightest part of the rock's going to be. Might as well just go ahead and fill that in right now with this light color that I got on the brush. I'm going to leave this part open so we can do some darker color. Let's go back to our palette. Give this brush a little bit of a wipe. Going from a light color to a darker color, you often don't really need to clean the brush. So I'm going to go ahead and just get some burnt umber and Payne's gray. Mix those together with some white. This nice dark brownish gray color. Alright, that's looking good. And we want our rock to have a nice sense of form. So we want some bright light on the top and a nice strong shadow underneath here. Go ahead and go all the way down to the bottom with this color now, I think. And the strongest part of the shadow is usually just right below the center, and then oftentimes on a rounded object, round or oval shaped object, there's some reflected light that makes the very bottom of it a little bit lighter than that deepest part of the shadow. So I want to blend this out up into that light area without pushing it too far. So I'm just going to gently sort of go across that edge so that it's not a solid edge anymore. I'm using the sort of side of the brush. I like to lay it flat on there for some of this textural stuff rather than using the tip of the brush. I'm just going to blend softly up into that. Again, I don't want to bring it too far. I want there to be some really bright light at the very top, but I do want there to be a sense of rounding over. So I'm going to blend right where this dark shadow and the light meet. Kind of go back and forth a few times until I've softened up that transition. Now, any rock that you see out in nature is going to have some texture to it. Okay, so that's why I kind of blended it out the way I did instead of doing these smooth brush strokes trying to get it to look like just a perfect orb. I want it to have some texture. So even up in this light area, I'm just going to just sort of touch the brush here and there and give it just a little bit of some texture up there without bringing that gray up too high. I still want that to be really light, but there should be just a couple of little hints of some texture up there. Then let's come down into this shadow. We can deepen it a little bit more, I think. So I'll just come back over where I've got the burnt umber and Payne's gray mix, but just go a little bit deeper into those two colors, a little bit less white. And let's just go right across the deepest part of the shadow, which is again just right below the center. Just add some of that darker color. And then I just want to break it up so that it doesn't have hard edges. I want this rock to have some texture. It's got sort of a smooth shape to it, but I still want it to have texture on its surface. You know, because it's a rock. It's not a bowling ball. Kind of looks a little bit like a potato, but you know, a lot of rocks look like potatoes, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, I think this one's starting to look pretty good. Pretty rock-like. Let's bring just a little bit of these darker shadows up here without getting rid of the transition color that we already put there. Just sort of adding a few little hints. We can even come up here and just add one or two real dark shadow marks in the top of the rock too. Just some deeper pock marks, if you will, on there. And I think that's pretty good. Let's just add maybe a little bit more texture across the very bottom and lighten up the very bottom of that rock. So I'm going to give this brush a little bit of a wipe and get just some lighter version of this gray that we mixed up before. A little bit more white maybe, something like that. And the color of this reflected light underneath the rock does get affected by sort of where it's sitting. So if there's, some reddish dirt or sand under there, then you'd have a reddish shadow. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go ahead and just put a little bit of some orange into this mix. I'll show you what this rock, the bottom of this rock would look like if it was sitting on some red dirt. You would just have this reflected light in the shadow that had that hint of reddishness to it. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. Let's move on. Let's do a blocky gray rock over here. Okay, so I'm going to give this brush a little bit of a rinse, a little bit of a wipe, and start over again with a nice light yellow ochre and white mix. This time we want a rock that just has sort of some fun blocky shape to it. I'll give it a little sort of a squarish face there, and then maybe sort of goes down to a point, kind of keeping it loose in the first stage. I always like to keep my sketches pretty loose in the first stage. And we'll have some strong light up here on the top. We'll have kind of a mid-tone here and then a darker shadow here. Let's go ahead and mix up a little bit of gray for that. So this time I'm going to get a little bit more of a bluish gray. So I'm just going to use that Payne's gray on its own. Get a little bit more white over here. And let's see, I think for the top of it, we'll start out with a lot of white and a little bit of Payne's gray. So I'll just go ahead and fill in top of that rock with this mix. It's mostly white with just a little bit of Payne's gray mixed in. And then let's move on to the next face here that'll have a little bit more of that gray. Just getting it a shade darker. And I do want it to have like a sharp edge around the outside, but where the colors meet, where the light gray and dark gray meet, kind of want to play around with that edge and have it not be as sharp. Alright, something like that. Now let's move on to this third side that's showing right now and get it even darker. So more Payne's gray. And let's just fill it in with that to start. And again, I want it to have a nice sharp edge around the outside. I might just kind of give it a little hint of a shadow down there on the edge of the light gray top. Just a little hint. And then maybe even where these two colors meet, bring out a little hint of that shadow color. Again, I don't want a super hard edge where these two grays meet, where the dark gray and the mid-tone gray meet. Don't want too sharp of an edge. And I'll go ahead and give it just a little bit of a shadow on that bottom edge there of the mid-tone part. Okay, so that gives us sort of a basic form for the rock, but we definitely need to play around and give it some texture. So let's start by using this dark gray that we've got to come across the top and sort of just cut into the rock a couple times. All right. I'm just gonna play around with this edge where these two colors meet too. Because, you know, it's not a brick, so it does have some sort of spots where one edge is gonna just kind of disappear into the other without being just a square cut. Okay, get a couple more little sort of cracks in the rock that go down here, I think. And now let's give this rock a little bit of color, a little bit of life, okay? And get this dark gray out of the brush first. Give it a little bit of a white, rinse. Try to make sure I don't have too much water in it when I go back to the canvas. Okay, this time I'm going to play around with a little bit of this magenta. Like I said before, even a gray rock has hints of other color usually in it. And it's fun to sort of accentuate that. So let's go over here into this mid-tone gray face and just lay the brush on there and just give it a hint of some other color, this magenta. Yeah, I like that. And I'll come into this shadow area and just add a couple little spots of that too. Without doing too much, I want to keep the basic sense that this is the dark side and this is the mid-tone and that's the light. So I don't want to like completely just cover any of these with the new little hints that I'm putting on there, these new colors. But I want to just add them in sort of sparsely to give that thing just a little bit more character. All right, let's get a little bit lighter color on the very top of that rock. Clean some of this magenta out. And let's get over here where we had our white and yellow ochre. Get mostly white on there. And we'll just sort of find where I put a little crack on there, and then, you know, you put a little light right under the crack, and it really looks like this portion of the rock is just popping up. Okay, and then once again, I really like this sort of technique of laying the brush against the canvas instead of using it, you know, dead on, perpendicular to the canvas. It just gives you this loose feel where, you know, you make more natural looking marks. All right, I think this rock is starting to look pretty good. I'm going to add a little bit more, just some hints of this light color on this face, this mid-tone face here, and then maybe just right here where this edge kind of comes down into the other one. And that rock's looking pretty good. Let's move on to kind of a more, you know, a little bit more orangey desert rock. Let's do one down here. So I'm gonna give this brush a little bit of a rinse. Get right back into my white and yellow ochre mix here. This is one of my favorite colors to sort of sketch with because it's so light and it's easy to change things up. So we'll give this sort of like a semi-blocky look, I think. And we'll give it a little shadow side over here, I think. We'll do like a mid-tone over here, and that'll be the light part on the top. Okay, so let's start with the shadow side on this. Now shadows can be warm. Let's do a nice warm shadow on this. I'm going to use my burnt umber. Add a little bit of that orange to it. Make a nice warm shadow on this rock. I took a trip one time down through Zion Park in Utah and saw some of those beautiful red rocks. And they have these rich reddish brown shadows to them. You know, a lot of times if you just like picture a rock in your head, you think of something that's gray, maybe more like this or kind of like that, but there's these rocks out there in the southwest that have these really beautiful warm shadow colors. So we're going to start like that. Might bring that just all the way across. And then let's get a little bit lighter on that face right here. So I'm gonna get some yellow ochre over here and just add a little bit of yellow ochre, maybe a hint of white to that same mix with the orange and burnt umber. Just need it to be a little bit lighter than that other color. That's actually too similar for me, so I'm gonna add a little bit more yellow ochre and a little bit more white. I want these faces of the rock to be distinct, okay? So let's try that. That's better. And I'm just going to fill in this section here. That nice, a little bit warmer, a little bit lighter tone. And then let's get extra light on the top. Keep it in that same kind of yellow ochre, white, a little bit of orange kind of territory. Heck, might I even add just a little bit of this Hansa yellow, why not? That's a lovely color, let's put that on the top. Okay. I'm gonna keep the outside edges sharp. And because this is sort of like a real blocky rock, I'm going to keep the other edges pretty sharp too. I'm not going to blend them into each other, but I do want to add some little hints of texture. So maybe there's, you know, a couple little spots where that rock bumps out. You can use this same color over here. You know, one of the things I love to play with is as a brush starts running out of paint, you get more subtle marks out of it. You know, you want a bold mark, you load the brush up. But as the brush is running out of paint, you can sort of come around some of these edges that you have on there and play with them using that brush that's sort of only got a little bit of color on it. A lot of times that's when you are able to make adjustments and kind of get a little bit more, you know, finesse to what you're doing. So I picked up a little bit of that dark color when I was blending along this edge, and I just dragged it up into that light face on the top, just to give it that part a little bit more texture. I think maybe I'll get a little bit deeper on this shadow here, and then we'll move on to our last rock. Okay, so I'm going to get back to my burnt umber. This time I'm going to mix a little bit of that quinacridone magenta with my burnt umber. Maybe you drag a little bit of Payne's gray and get a nice kind of purpley tone going. And let's put that just along the bottom. Mostly just keep it on this shadow side here, the darkest shadow side. And then I'm just going to sort of blend it out up into the rest of that shadow tone. And you see I had this little light edge that I put in there. I decided to put some of that darker color right above it. And again, that just sort of pushes the texture a little bit deeper. Okay, I add it just across the very bottom here. Bring it just right around. And I think we'll call this rock done. And let's do a fun moss-covered rock over here in the corner. That'll finish it out for us. Give this brush a little white, a little rinse. And now, I mean, one of my favorite things about the Santa Cruz Mountains where I live is that if you go hiking through the forest, you'll see all these rocks that are just covered in moss. And they'll have like just whole little, you know, ecosystems right there on the rock. It's really beautiful to see. Different colors that you might or might not expect to see on a rock. I'm going to give this one like a little bit more, some kind of rounded edges. We'll make it pretty big. Something like that. And now for this, I want to outline a couple of areas where I'm going to have the moss growing on it and then some of the bare rock showing underneath that. Okay, so I want some moss growing on the top like this, and we'll even have like a little bit of a spot where the moss really, you know, sort of mounds up on top of there. And I think that'll be about good for the sort of outline of the rock. Now let's go ahead and start with the part of the rock that is the bare rock, call it, I guess, the kind of grayish part. So let's use a little bit of this Payne's gray and white, but warm it up a little bit. Maybe I'll drag a little bit of this orange and burnt umber into it. That's a nice color. Let's start with that. So again, I'm gonna have some moss sitting on top of that rock, but I want some bare rock showing underneath that. I'll use this color to kind of get that started. And we're gonna get real dark right at the bottom of this rock, I think. So let's get over here and just put a dark shadow at the bottom. That'll just be Payne's gray and burnt umber. Those two together pretty much make it black. Let's add a little bit of quinacridone magenta just to warm it up though. All right, bottom of this rock. It's just gonna be super dark. And I want some texture. I'm gonna do some sort of vertical texture on this. Sometimes, you know, they have these sort of striations in the rock. So let's just put some of that in. Just to keep things interesting. If you do while both these colors are wet, you'll see I'll get a little bit of dark color up in the top part, but it'll also drag a little bit of light color down into the bottom part. You know, a lot of people say you can't blend well with acrylics, but you know, if you know what you're doing, if you get after it right away, you actually can. You can do a lot of cool blending techniques. And I want to put a shadow right here where the bottom of the moss is going to be, sort of sitting up on that. Kind of keep it going around here. Again, we're going to put some nice, cool green moss on there. And we'll do another little shadow right here. Let's get a little bit more color on the brush. Payne's gray, a little burnt umber, a little quinacridone magenta, and just right where we have this little hump of moss that's going to stick up, put a little shadow above that. Alright, that's pretty good. I'm going to add just a little bit more kind of around the edges, just to give this a real solid feel. And let's get into that moss. Get over here and get that brush a little bit cleaned out. And we'll start just by mixing up a green. We'll get some yellow and ultramarine blue. That's a pretty decent green to start with. Let's lay that on there. So I'm going to start just by putting this same green everywhere where I want the moss. Then we'll play around with our highlights and our texture. I really like to sort of get the area that I'm working on covered as quick as possible. Something about that white canvas just staring up at me. I don't like it. I like to work with having a little bit of color on the canvas. So now that I've got that green on there, making sure I've kind of, you know, put a little bit wherever there was some open space. Now that I've got that on there, now I'm going to play around with the shape of the moss. Okay, so let's go back to our palette, get some of that green that I got mixed up, and let's add a little bit of red to it. That's going to give us a nice dark shadow with a nice richness to it. Now, a lot of times, a mistake that beginners make when they're painting green tones is that they only use blue and yellow. And greens, I mean, there are a million greens out there in nature, and most of them have a little hint of red or orange mixed in. That's the sort of magical ingredient that a lot of people miss. Okay, let's get a little darker. You know, it took me a while to figure that out, but once I started adding a little hint of red to some of my, especially the darker greens, and then on the light greens I'll add a little orange a lot of times. Once I started doing that, I started noticing my greens looking a lot more realistic. And Most of the time I like to paint things that look pretty realistic. So there's a hint for you about painting greens, is that a lot of times you try to get the green just right, you might be missing a little hint of red or orange. So I'm just kind of coming through in the bottom of this part that I've already painted green, and I'm just adding that darker tone. I want it to sort of be broken up. I want it to have, texture. Moss has a lot of tiny little, it's almost like a million little tiny ferns when you get right up close. So let's get in there with a little brush. But here we are. I've got my yellow, a little bit of this green that I already had mixed up, and a hint of white, okay? Getting a lot lighter now. Let's take that color over here, and just at the very top of some of these, shapes that we've made, I'm going to add some highlights. Okay, get some more of that. And we'll just, right where this sort of one shape stands out against the other, just give it a little bit of a highlight on the top. And then even coming into this some of these darker areas and just making up a new little spot where the moss sort of bumps up. You can play around with it. But then we want to get a little bit extra sort of fuzzy texture to it, right? So let's get a little bit more of that on the brush, and we'll start kind of bouncing it around. I've got the color kind of laid on there. Now I'm just sort of bouncing the brush on there where I've already laid that color, and breaking it up and giving it, just sort of a little bit of a fuzzy feel. Now, one of the things about creating texture that I've noticed is that you don't necessarily need to put texture everywhere, but if you have enough hints of texture here and there, something about it will your brain will fill it in the rest of the way. So if you just put it sort of right on the brightest parts and a little bit where that bright part transitions into the mid-tone, something about it, your brain will just sort of think, okay, well, there's texture all through that green. All right, now I think this rock has some lovely green tones, but we want a little bit darker shadow under the moss and then a couple of hints of some orange to balance it out. So let's get back to our palette, give this thing a rinse, and I'll just use this detail brush with my dark color, that's the Payne's Gray and Quinacridone Magenta, and let's just come across the base of this moss, give it a little deeper shadow. Get a little bit more on the brush. Work the rest of the way across here. Give a shadow to these other bits of moss that I put down here too. And maybe we'll come in and just sort of deepen a couple of these green shadows here too. All right. Pretty good, I think. Let's, I kind of want to play around with the shadow on the base of this rock too. Just get a little bit darker, a little bit more contrast with the brightness of the top of the rock. And then I think we want a couple hints of some orange tone in that rock right there. When you see a mossy rock in the forest, a lot of times it has little bits of, leaves from the trees above that have fallen onto it. Sometimes there's just little bits of dried up moss that get kind of an orangey tone. So I'm mixing some yellow ochre and some vat orange, getting a little bit of that Hansa yellow in there. Let's see what that looks like over here. Just want to put a couple little hints. Mostly I want this on there because orange and green are sort of opposite in the color spectrum, and it's nice to have that balance. But also, like I said, it's realistic because a lot of times there's these little leaves, maybe a madrone tree over it has this orange leafy bark that falls down off, things like that. All right, I think that rock is starting to look pretty good. I want a little bit brighter highlights on my moss though. So, just gonna get some white with a tiny bit of that orange, or sorry, yellow and green tone that we mixed up. This is mostly white, but I'm just flavoring it a little bit. And just right across the top of some of these mounds of moss that are sticking up like that. Just a couple little highlights. Just help make it pop. I'm gonna get a little bit more on the brush and come in here and just add a little bit more. I think that rock's looking pretty good. All right, folks, I think we're gonna call it done. So I wanna thank you for joining me. I hope these rock painting tutorials are helpful for you. And please like and subscribe. Acrylics Made Easy. We're gonna paint a whole lot more soon. Thanks, folks.